Hey everybody, just so you won't be confused when you hear different intro music than normal this episode, I want to explain to you that what you're about to hear is a crossover episode I recently did with my friends at the Online Great Books podcast, talking about the wonderful essay Art and Scholasticism by the Catholic philosopher Jacques Maritain. The discussion will be released in two parts. This is part one, and you'll be hearing part two next week. I've been wanting to discuss this book on the podcast for a while, so I hope you enjoy.
Welcome to the Online Great Books podcast, brought to you by OnlineGreatBooks.com, where we talk about the good life, the great books, great conversation, and great ideas.
Welcome back to Online Great Books Podcast. Dear listener, this is Brett. I am the producer. And today, Scott and Karl welcome Thomas Miris from Catholic Culture Podcast to this discussion of the 1920 book Art and Scholasticism by Jacques Maritain. Maritain was a very prolific French Catholic philosopher, active for a good portion of the 20th century. He's the author of over 60 books. And he's a man with many interesting associations, and that will be discussed in the show today as well. Scott is quite curious about this gentleman and the company that he kept in some periods of his life. This discussion is split into two parts, as is the usual around here. Today, an introduction to Maritain and this book, and next week's episode is a very substantial discussion that deals more with the contents of the book. So thank you so much for your time and attention. Thank you for listening, and we'll get right to it.
I'm Scott Hambrick.
I'm Karl Schudt.
I'm Thomas Miris.
Oh, hey, and that's Thomas Miris. And today on the Online Great Books podcast, we're going to talk about Jacques Maritain's Art and Scholasticism. Thomas is the host of the Catholic Culture Podcast, and what's the other one?
I run a little podcast network associated with a website called CatholicCulture.org. We have 4 shows, 2 of which I host. So I host the Catholic Culture Podcast, which is an interview show on a wide range of topics, but focusing on arts and culture, Catholic arts and culture. I co-host a show that you guys have both been on, Criteria, the Catholic Film Podcast. It's kind of like a compliment to what you guys do on your 2 shows, except with a little bit of a religious slant.
Wait, can I interrupt you for a second?
Sure.
Because I can just hear off in podcast land a bunch of people saying, oh, crap, Catholic stuff, click.
Oh.
Yeah, get lost.
It is my tribe as well, and so I would not do that. But why would, say, a Protestant want to listen to us talk about a Catholic talk about art?
Oh, sure. First of all, I'd just say, because we were talking about the podcast, like all of them deal with great books adjacent things. All of those 4 shows that I'm involved with, either as a producer or a host, I mean, because on the Catholic Culture Podcast, I'm very often dealing with universal philosophical issues. I'm dealing with great works of art. I'm dealing with Renaissance polyphony, or just things that are universally considered great in Western culture. Not always in Western culture, but mostly in Western culture. Mm-hmm. The film podcast, our kind of hook for the show is we're going through the Vatican film list, which came out in 1995, although we're going off of it too. But virtually every film on that list is universally canonized as one of the great films of world cinema over the past 100 years. Yeah. And then the other 2 shows I produce, one of them is called Catholic Culture Audiobooks. And in that, we've actually recorded some of the authors on the great books list, on Adler's list, things by St. Augustine, for example, De Doctrina Christiana, his work on rhetoric and scriptural interpretation. That's on the great books list. That's going to be read in the Online Great Books program at some point if people get that far. So it's a lot of the church fathers. It's a lot of St. John Henry Newman, another figure who shows up on there a lot, is very important in educational theory. I can't imagine that Mortimer Adler was not familiar with his thinking on that. He wrote a great book called The Idea of a University. Then the other show we have, Way of the Fathers, is a history podcast about the fathers of the church. So these are kind of like the great books specifically of Christianity of the first 5 or so centuries Well, anybody who wants to know about Western history should be interested in that. I mean, they don't have to listen to, of course, but of course, Protestants should be interested in that as well, because it's what the very earliest Christians believed.
I just wanted to be provocative on that.
Oh, you want to provoke me?
Provoke you?
Yeah, I got the inflammatory answer. The Protestants should listen because they don't have a notion of aesthetics. Like, accidentally, Bach will step into beauty, but they really can't tell you what that is and why it is beautiful and why it is important. They're like, oh, it's pretty, and that's kind of the answer.
We have a tradition. Right. We have a tradition. So do the Eastern people. The Eastern Catholics and the Orthodox. Yeah. Well, I was going to get there. Maritain too has a connection to Adler. They were friends. Maritain really admired what Adler and Hutchins were doing, and they were, and at least Adler was definitely influenced by Maritain. I think one of the very last books on the Great Books list is by one of Maritain's early teachers, Henri Bergson. This is before Maritain became Catholic, but he kind of introduced him to metaphysics and basically convinced him not to kill himself for that reason. So there's a lot of connections to, all the stuff that's in the wheelhouse of your podcast. But yeah, as far as the specific subject matter of art goes, this book, Art and Scholasticism, that we're going to discuss from 1920, this book was received by quite a number of artists who were not practicing Catholics. Or even practicing Christians. I mean, this is quite an influential book. This is back in the day when there were more Catholic thinkers, serious Catholic thinkers in the public square, and I guess I should say more serious thinkers in the public square, period. But, people who read this book would include T.S. Eliot, Alan Tate, Flannery O'Connor, Francois Mauriac, Igor Stravinsky, and Maritain himself, in my opinion, gets art better than any other philosopher who came before him in the Western tradition. And I think a big reason for that, aside from, being a Thomist and his brilliance and all of the gifts that he brought to that, is that he hung out with artists all the time and he learned from them. I mean, he hung out with guys like Eric Satie, Jean Cocteau, novelists like Bernanos, Marc Chagall, Georges Rouault, all these great French artists of kind of like the between World War I, World War II period. His wife was also a poet. So he hung out with artists and learned from them, and also was just a student of the whole artistic tradition, and not just Western art either. It's something that he's interested in more than just an abstract way. I mean, like if you look at a lot of earlier Western philosophy on, say, music, they're interested in like the music of the spheres, or these kind of like abstracted notions that are not necessarily that much about the concrete sort of the way a musician thinks, the way that his mind works, the virtue of being a musician. And these are things that you can find implicitly in the thought of Thomas Aquinas and the other scholastics who he's drawing from. But he's kind of one of the first people to really like elucidate this whole thought on art from just a few little things scattered here and there throughout Aquinas, who doesn't really have a great deal of interest in art for its own sake in the sense of the fine arts. But there's a lot of things to draw on that you can really get like a whole body of work from.
Right. Okay. And I want to add also for our non-Catholic listeners, I hope they're still listening. I remember I was reading John Meyendorff, who's an Orthodox, I believe he's a priest, Orthodox priest, and he was writing about Catholic thought on marriage and family, and he said, just because it's Catholic doesn't mean it's wrong. So
yeah, well, that is also true. So I don't know. Yeah, it's an amazing book. There's a ton to draw on it. This book, it's really an essay, and it's about 60 pages or so in my edition, but it really covers a lot of ground. You could draw a heck of a lot from it. And a lot of artists have drawn a lot of practical things from it over the years.
Yeah, y'all are making too much of this Catholic stuff.
I feel like you're protesting too much, or asking me to protest too much or something. But, yeah, it's interesting. I mentioned he was part of the kind of the public conversation, and some of that might not, endear him to Scott. But for example, if anybody's ever been to Coit Tower in San Francisco, they've got a mural on the inside of the tower, which is kind of a scene of people in a library, and you can see like different authors' names on the spines of the books. And one of them, I saw Maritain's name on the spine of one of the books in this mural. And so I was like, oh, okay. So like this is a guy who was at one point known and respected. I feel like I even heard Leonard Bernstein read Art and Scholasticism. I could be misremembering. I mean, he also is very influential outside of that. I mean, the guy helped draft the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
You're not winning me over here.
Yeah, but I may be winning some of the audience.
Well, they need to turn
to see
off.
This is more than like a sectarian writer.
Yeah. Well, Maritain, he's trying to approach aesthetics here from a scholastic, with a scholastic approach, which is really sort of an Aristotelian approach. If you like your Aristotle, you will recognize that here, and you will appreciate that. This guy has put together a very orderly and complete treatment of his theory of aesthetics, I think, here with this little short thing, Art and Aesthetics. I've got the Clooney Media copy here in my hot little hand. That's what Karl has. Is that what you've got? Yeah, great
publisher.
Thomas? Is that what you have? Make sure we're all on the same pages.
I have an old out-of-print edition that my sister gave me that she used in college years and years ago. This was my second time reading this. My first time was about 12 years ago when I was in college.
So that's the one we're cracking here.
You can find it online, too, at the Notre Dame's Maritain Center online. It's a different translation than, I think, the Clooney Media, and the one that I have is by J.F. Scanlon, and theirs is by someone else.
But really, can you read a book on aesthetics in a browser?
Right.
Yeah, well...
So he's got this orderly approach and the scholastic approach, this Thomist approach to aesthetics that is super dry, absolutely zero fun to read for me.
I don't know.
Good. He does a good job, and in the pages of this I had no problems. And then I see all of these other things that these other associations in his life that I find disgusting and repugnant, and I can't square it all. Like, he's a great friend of Saul Alinsky, who I think is one of the lesser Satans. He's a friend of the UN, which is maybe one of the greater ones. I don't get it. And I can't even conceive of an explanation that I could hear that would make me say, oh, I understand now.
Uh-huh. Sure. Well, as far as the UN goes, I can't speak on that too much, other than I think that there was a lot more optimism in the 1950s about that sort of thing than would be justifiable in somebody with Maritain's beliefs now.
But how could a Thomist ever look at that and say, okay, this jives?
Mm-hmm.
How could somebody that had read Aristotle's Politics and was a Thomist go to the UN building in New York City and say, okay, I'll help you guys? I don't get it.
Uh-huh. Yeah, it's hard for me to respond to that because I don't really know much about what the UN was back then. So, I'm not on the historical stuff. I know more about the Alinsky thing. That's something that I've looked into because it freaked me out a little bit when I found out about it. But at that time, I'd already read so much of Maritain and already had so much respect for him that it was less like, oh, this is turning me off from this guy altogether, and more like you said, okay, how do I square this? What's the deal with that? One of the things with Alinsky is, well, first of all, Maritain was not a political conservative for much of his life. He was kind of radical by disposition, but earlier in his life that took sort of right-wing forms. The other thing is, one of the other things is Maritain was just friends with everyone, and he was trying to convert everyone. So he converted a lot of those French artists not a lot, but a few of those French artists in the sort of interwar period. He brought Eric Satie back to the church on his deathbed. So he was friends with people and wanted to see the best in people. I think that he was a bit politically naive. He really loved American democracy, and Alinsky
You're not winning me, man.
Well, yeah, but I think this is why I didn't want to talk about this at the beginning, because it's a separate issue from the art. But since we're talking about it, Alinsky was a guy at one point who was able to convince a lot of people that he was just, a lovably provocative dude who loved democracy and the poor. And he also made a special practice of duping Catholics, I have to say, unfortunately. One of the things is that, Rules for Radicals is not written until the year before Maritain's death. He met him much earlier. He encouraged him to write the 1946 book Reveille for Radicals, if I'm pronouncing that word correctly. Reveille. Yeah. And Rules for Radicals is written in 1971, and he criticizes Rules for Radicals. The last letter we have between them is Maritain's critique of Rules for Radicals. I think he's a bit optimistic about Alinsky's basic intentions, but he makes clear that he disagrees with him fundamentally on a lot of philosophical issues. From what I understand, not having read it, the earlier book is about methods of community organizing, but it's not about philosophical principles. Maritain, from what I've read, seems to have thought the vision of community organizing laid out in that book really reflected kind of the traditional idea of subsidiarity and the function of intermediary institutions between the state and the individual, which is something he was concerned about. And I don't know that much more about it. I would say he either thought Alinsky's motives were different than they were, or Alinsky's motives changed over the years, because he is quite critical of rules.
Or he agreed with him, because he's also like a Rawlsian consensus ethics guy.
What ethics?
Consensus ethics. Yeah, he also shares some views with Rawls. Maritain.
I haven't encountered that. I'm not a Maritain expert. I remember a comment Edith Stein says that he said, suggestion that he made about original sin and ethics. Well, this is probably 1930 though. That if original sin is true, you can't do ethics without understanding it. Any ethics that you do is going to fail.
I would be seriously Maritain is quite critical of a lot of modern philosophy, and without having read those works, which I don't think either of us has, I would be really hesitant to make a statement like that based on like somebody else's summary or something like that. I mean, the other thing is that Maritain's views change over the years, particularly in politics. This is quite early for him. This is, I think, the first major thing he wrote about art, for example. This is 1920.
So this is the good Maritain before the bad Maritain.
Well, look at this. One of the things. It may be the case. I don't think he became a bad person, but it may be the case. From what I understand, for example, his work in the past couple of years on political philosophy and sort of democratic pluralism and religious liberty and stuff has been, I would say, reevaluated in certain Catholic intellectual sectors, particularly by the integralist types in the past couple of years. I'm very sympathetic with their critique. I think sometimes they're a little harsh on him, but the one book of his that I've read on politics is an early one called the Primacy of the Spiritual, or The Things That Are Not Caesar's. And that book is not at all what you would, I forget the year of that, I think it's in the 20s. And that book is not at all what you would expect from the criticisms of his later writings on political philosophy by sort of more right-wing Catholics. So I don't think that we should let whatever reservations we might have about other stuff later on affect our views of this particular book. Again, I mean, he doesn't even meet Alinsky for like 20, 25 years. I forget, 40s or 50s. Maritain's active from at least like the 1910s through the early 70s as a philosopher, and he writes about just about every branch of philosophy there is. Yeah, I have a high opinion of him as a person, and I know enough about him not to doubt his good intentions. And I also know enough about his philosophy and have read enough of it and excerpts from some of his work on other topics than art to know that this was like a really profound thinker, certainly a disciple of Thomas Aquinas.
Well, let's get to some of the thinking now that we've punched him a bit. He's got this theory of art. On the one hand, I think it's probably correct. On the other hand, I wonder, how could it be effective for the audience? But one of the big things that for anybody nowadays is the idea that art is a making, versus say intellectual virtues, which are about understanding. Art is about doing.
So he makes this series of distinctions, and he starts with the speculative versus the practical intellect, and then within the practical intellect he divides between making and doing. Yeah
So it's a making, and I found very productive the thought that all making is art.
Right.
So plumbing, for example, is art.
Yeah, shipbuilding.
Yeah, landscaping is art.
All making.
Yeah. And this is because this is partially because he is starting with this scholastic definition, which was not particularly concerned with the distinction between the art of the craftsman or the artisan and what we would now call the fine arts. And he finds that to be a productive way of starting the discussion before you get into kind of the beauty aspect of it. And I think he does get a lot of fruit from that way of formulating it.
I was thinking about it So we mentioned Bach before, and I've done a little work in church music, and I think you have as well, Thomas.
Just a little.
And I just, don't you do a lot of it? Or?
No, most of my work has been secular. I've only done a couple of church gigs here and there. I took organ lessons for a few months, but dropped it. I'm trained as a jazz pianist, so that's
you have to play with your feet.
Oh yeah, that's hard, man. It's like playing
wear
the drums.
Those weird shoes.
That's weird. So I was thrust into a position as a choir director for a while in a church where everything is sung. There's no instruments, and you just got to produce music, and it doesn't matter. There's a silence, and that's bad. So we have to produce music all the time, and so it's kind of like plumbing. You have to stop the leak. It's a making. It's very much a making, and I always think of Bach that way, that he's got. I guess he worked in the cathedral, whatever town he worked in, the big Lutheran church in Dresden, I think, wherever he was. And he's got to produce music all the time. And of course, he does it very, very well. And him having the habitus of music much more than I do. So we have to talk about that too. When he's doing the plumbing, lots of the time it's brilliant.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas when I'm doing the plumbing, it wasn't brilliant so often. I did one or two nice things, but mostly it was, plugging the leaks. But I think we have this image of art that he talks about too, as we have this romantic image of art where, you go off into solitude and you do a lot of drugs and you reach deep down into the darkness of your soul and you come up with some new original establishment of meaning. And that's not what it is. It's practical.
Yeah.
It's making something.
One thing I love about Maritain is that I think that he gets what's true in that, but situates it within this much more sober, scholastic approach. And in his later books, this kind of lays out a lot of things that he's going to explore in more detail. So he has a series of talks called The Responsibility of the Artist, which are just about the subject matter of that last chapter on art and prudence, art and morality. Then he has a later book, probably his longest book on art, is Creative Intuition in Art and Poetry. And then there he's getting into what sets, the fine arts apart. Like, what is it that the artist has in him that allows him to bring forth beauty in a work of art? But in this book, he's especially focusing on this sober scholastic framework. We should probably say, for clarity's sake, too, that when he says art, he is talking not about a thing, an object made by an artist. He is talking about the virtue or the habit of art. So it might get confusing. So we can talk about a work of art, the object of art, the thing made by the artist, but he's talking about the habit of art when he simply says art. So it's a virtue of not the speculative. It's a virtue of the practical intellect, and that's kind of what the book is about. And the reason he makes this distinction between doing and making is because it's very important to understand the formal end of any given virtue, right? So the purpose of the virtue to which it tends. The end of art, as such, formally speaking, is the good of the thing made. So it's not actually the good of man. It's not the good of the artist. The virtue of art in itself, taken formally, aims towards, actually there's this scholastic phrase, recta ratio factibilium, and Maritain translates this as the undeviating determination of work to be done, which I kind of like. I like that undeviating, and that kind of gets to the fact that this is a virtue and it's infallible insofar as it's put into use.
Yeah, so we've made a distinction we ought to clear up a little bit. Prudence, so there's a quote from Maritain, I think it's on page 17 of ours. Prudence operates for the good of the worker. Art operates for the good of the work done.
Mm-hmm.
So prudence is the virtue of knowing what exactly to do in a particular situation.
Yeah.
And it's for you. It's so that you don't sin, so that you don't do wrong things.
Yeah.
Art is for the sake of the work done. I have a book of early church fathers on music, on cantors, and one of the quotes in there is this admonition to the cantor, which used to be an ordained role. You sing for the glory of God while your life leads you down to hell, and that's possible to do.
Yeah, that's one of the things. Yeah, In The Responsibility of the Artist, he has a line where he says, Oscar Wilde was just being a good Thomist when he said, a man's being a poisoner is nothing against his prose.
Yeah, poor Oscar.
Oh, yeah, he's pretty harsh on Oscar Wilde in a number of his books, actually.
Well, rightly. These scholastics have to get all the metaphysics right. They have to know what everything is in its finest detail before they can do anything else.
Right.
So in my book, this is 80 pages. This essay is 80 pages. 40 of it is just what the metaphysics of what is art.
Yeah.
That can be dry and something that maybe you don't want to read for sport or fun, but man, it's so important. He says, the error in the aesthetics of modern philosophy, which, considering under art the fine arts only, and dealing with the beautiful only as it concerns art, runs the risk of spoiling the proper conception of both fine arts and beauty, At Online Great Books, we've got all kinds of people that are thoughtful and like to do interesting things and are interested in beauty. And we have a channel called OGB Art, and people do stuff. And a lot of these people don't want to do anything because they don't think it'll be beautiful enough. Or they do things that are interesting, but they don't conceive it to be art, like make a really nice bench to put in the mudroom to sit on when you change your shoes.
Yeah.
The modern conception of art has disqualified, in people's own minds, has disqualified them from doing fine things. And that is disgusting. Yeah. It is a huge problem.
Yeah.
And it hurts most of us. He says, there, right at the end of that first chapter, we need this better understanding of art. And then he says, at a time when the necessity of escaping from the vast intellectual confusion bequeathed to us by the 19th century and finding once more the spiritual conditions of work which shall be honest is everywhere felt. He thinks if we really know what art is, then we'll be more connected to honest work, and that will be a refuge from this intellectual confusion, this metaphysical disgustingness around us. And we see it all the time. Like, oh, listen, son, you need to go to college. You need a job where you're clean, a white collar job, because that's respectable, and that's what good people do. So, if you do stuff where you get dirty or actually use your body to work, that's not genteel. That's not respectable. That's base.
Right.
They would rather, people in the United States, by and large, would rather their kid sit in a cubicle, had the HR mammy hit them on the head, and finish the TPS reports than have a kid that soldered good joints and was a good plumber. And Maritain would have none of that.
Yeah. So, one of the wonderful things about this philosopher we just read is that he, very much like Aquinas, is not willing to let a drop of truth be lost. So he's going to actually give the artisan his dignity while maintaining that there's a lot of truth to this greater self-consciousness of the fine arts that's developed over the centuries, that they are different, they are something higher. So he can say, he can emphasize that art, even the art of the shipbuilder or the benchmaker or whatever, is fundamentally an intellectual virtue. It's not actually manual labor. The manual labor is something extrinsic, he says, to the virtue of art. And of course, that's actually a pretty important point for artists to understand too, right? It's not just about your chops.
Right.
He can also go on and later say that the fine arts are to art as a whole as, man is to the genus of animal. And so he's able to give both their proper dignity, and by elevating the fine arts, he doesn't do it in such a way that degrades the art of the artisan. It's like they're both lifted up in this vision.
Because he's Aristotelian, right? He knows the four causes, right?
Right.
So he says, if you're a shaker and you're building a chair, the final cause of your work is that someone may be seated well. But if it's fine art, the final cause is just beauty, which shares a root with the beatific.
Yeah.
Right? It's there's godliness in it. So he's able to elevate the fine arts without deucing on the things that make the toilets flush. He holds them both in esteem, and he's able to hold them both in esteem without denigrating the other. I know a lot of rednecks that are welders and make beautiful welds and build things and do things with their hands, and they hate the fine arts. Right? It's not just the art nerd that went to the art school who thinks less of the plumber, but I know some plumbers that don't think much of the fine arts either, right? Because it doesn't have that practical end. They're like, what good is this?
These things have been cloven apart so much, and like you could almost make an analogy to like music, how like classical music needs to draw on folk music. And folk music needs to be, draw on classical music in some sense. It needs to breathe the same air culturally so that it can be elevated. And of course, I would say they're both arts of the beautiful in this case, but it's just, it's an analogy. And so when you base the dignity of the fine arts on something that's actually not the source of its dignity, which would be like something about, your subconscious
or its impracticality, in fact, is one of the quote unquote good things about it now. That is actually one of the Maritainists' good things about it, right? It's like it isn't a tool, it isn't a practical thing, it is a thing of beauty. And for him, he makes distinctions
in order to unite, which is the classic Thomist thing. It's like at the end, he actually brings it back and shows how art fits into the goods of human life and the goods of the common good in society and the church. His last couple of chapters are on art and religion, art and morality. So he's keeping the distinction, he's keeping the proper end of art while uniting it in human subject with all these human goods and the final end of man, So it's really beautifully done, and so many others have strayed on one side or the other. I certainly wouldn't want to like attempt to go back to like artists seeing themselves only as craftsmen.
I kind of would.
You can't open that door once it's been opened, because there's some real truth there. There's a spirit, there's a deeper spiritual thing going on here, where if you see yourself merely as someone who's making something for practical use, we would lose this, instrumental music, for example.
Would Michelangelo, with his hammer and chisel, do you think that he would say that he was a craftsman or an artist?
I'm not sure. It seems like there was a little bit more. It seems like a lot of the self-consciousness of artists came in the Renaissance. So by his point, you might get to that. He kind of slams Da Vinci a little bit, and I think it's in a footnote. He doesn't slam him, but he says he was a great artist, but he makes some truly embarrassing justifications for his art. Like, a monkey saw this monkey that was painted on a wall and thought it was another real monkey and started dancing around and playing with it, as though that gives art its dignity. It's it's ridiculous, But of course, he doesn't say that Da Vinci wasn't an artist because he said that. It's just that, his thinking was maybe not quite right as to what the value of what he was doing was at every point.
He has this notion of beauty as a beast, which I thought was pretty productive. For me, this is on page 24. He's talking about the Middle Ages, those terrible Middle Ages. More beautiful things were then created, and there was less self-worship. The blessed humility in which the artist was situated exalted his strength and his freedom. The Renaissance was destined to drive the artist mad and make him the most miserable of men at the very moment when the world was to become less habitable for him. By revealing to him his own grandeur and letting loose upon him the wild beast beauty, which faith kept enchanted and led after it obedient with a gossamer thread for a leash.
See, yes, Maritain can be dry when he says is most scholastic, but he can also be quite poetic, especially I would say in the later parts of the essay.
So the wild beast beauty. So, all right. So I was listening to Shostakovich today. I'm sorry, which is about as modern as I get. Sure. And there's a bit of the wild beast beauty in him. It's about as far as I want to go away from tonality. The restraint makes it better. And so I was thinking about this book, and it was part of my frustration with it, because art, especially the fine arts, is for the sake of beauty. It's for the sake of delight. But it's a beauty because beauty is convertible with being for a scholastic. It's a beauty that's another word for the good and for that which is. And so in order to do it right, you have to have, it seems to me, some sort of metaphysical intuition into beauty itself.
Yeah.
And then I got frustrated with the book, and I thought, I'm going to yell at Thomas for this, because what good would this book be to anybody nowadays who does not already share something like a medieval metaphysics? And then I thought, so this is me arguing with myself. Then I thought, well, maybe we'd need some kind of boot camp. Okay, a boot camp for artists, where you have to get them the proper metaphysics.
Well, my friends just started one, actually.
Oh yeah, how do they do it? Because I have my ideas. Tell me what your friends do, and they'll see what my
well,
camp
first
would
of
be
all,
like.
let me say that, I mean, this book did in fact succeed in introducing a number of artists of the 20th century to these ideas who weren't previously familiar to them. So like this actually gave them that introduction and that framework. But yeah, so my friends who I've had on my podcast a bunch of times, James Matthew Wilson, who's a poet and a philosopher, one of the foremost writers in formal verse in the country. My friend Joshua Wren, who is a fiction writer and a poet, an essayist, and runs a small Catholic publisher called Wise Blood Books. They just started an MFA program at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, and they just started their first year, and it has the Catholic intellectual tradition component of Aquinas, etc., Aristotle, the classical thought on art and beauty, and then it has a practical workshop component. So it's kind of the first of its kind to have both, to be really distinctively in the Catholic intellectual tradition, but also to be run by people who are, experienced practitioners of the arts. So it has a poetry and a fiction component. I don't know that much else about it. I think they have about 40 people in the first class, and it's non-residential, so you can do it online.
All right, so I would do it differently. That's very good. It's kind of like an apprenticeship, which Maritain talks about, that art needs to be done on the apprentice model, where you just start doing it under a master. I think that's very good. But I think for a lot of folks, I think they need to be grounded in reality. So here's my idea. You take them out to the farm, and you have them plant stuff, and you have them tend it, and you have them deal with livestock, and get them really grounded in reality. Because it's very easy, if you're a city dweller, if you're a modern person who gets all your stuff from a grocery store, it's very easy to get distance from nature. And he has some things in here about, I thought his comments on imitative art were interesting as well, that he's not a huge fan of it, but that you need to look at nature as a teacher to you on how to do your art. And I thought it would be very good to have people actually have worked on the other continuum of art. So if art is all making, before you get to the fine arts, which are making simply for the joy of apprehension and beauty, you got to be able to make stuff and realize that things have their thingness.
Yeah. Well, we could all stand to be more in touch with reality than not. I think that would help a lot of things.
I mean, I've been listening, I'm going to plug another podcast. I've been listening to the Farmstead Meatsmith, which is great fun. I think they're Catholic. I'm sure they're Catholic. Husband and wife. And how would you describe him? Well, he's a butcher and slaughter guy. But he's talking about the telos of the pig. How does this pig best express its being? Well, it says bacon, and you have to do it the right way. And there are rules on how you kill a pig. And if you do it wrong, you're going to make more pain for the pig. And I'm thinking this guy is in touch with the ontological mystery every day. And that makes me sad about the craftsmen that think that what they're doing is not art, this gap between the crafts and the fine arts. I don't think it should be there, because you're doing the same thing.
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't say that there should be no distinction between the two, but it should be more porous. I mean, it should be like the beauty should be allowed to go both ways, if that makes sense. It's like it's less that it should be less that the crafts are not beautiful and more that that's not their primary purpose, right? Like aesthetic beauty is not the primary purpose of the craft of the welder.
Yeah.
But it shouldn't be that he's not making beautiful things, according to his tradition.
Well, and if you walk through an old building in Europe, a medieval building. I used to, when I was in Europe, I would go to the cathedral in every town I went in and climb the tower. And you look at this building, everything in it is beautiful.
Yeah.
because every stonecutter, every mason, I guess, every person making a window is making something beautiful. Even though, so the window, like all the stained glass windows, they're there to keep out the wind and the rain. That's what windows are for, and to let in the light. But we're not just going to let it, we're just not going to do it. We're going to do it with a focus on beauty.
With style.
Yeah, style points count. So when he said that more beautiful things were then created and there was less self-worship, and that's another thing. You don't know who any of those artisans were.
That's right.
Because they don't sign it.
Yeah. And not everybody has to be a genius, too, into that system, especially when you have that kind of apprenticeship. And when I say genius, I mean basically someone with a gift from God, because I do believe that as far as the arts of the beautiful are concerned, you either have the gift or you don't. But I also believe that all human beings are artists in some sense, which is what Maritain kind of starts out with.
Yeah, if you participate in making, which is actually touching things and doing things, but it's also thinking. He talks about intellectual arts, so it's also thinking.
Logic.
And the physical making cannot be separated from the intellectual making. I just sent you guys a picture of the greenhouse I'm building. This thing didn't exist.
Yeah, I just saw it. Really nice.
Clearly, until I started building it, and there weren't no drawings. I made drawings for it. I have spent more time thinking about it than I have putting it together. And while I put it together, I find that I've had to revise my drawings. they weren't right, and make changes along the way. There is way more thinking going on than fastening and cutting and assembling. It's been very interesting. And while I'm doing that, I can't do anything else. I'm still on page 11. You guys keep trying to get up in the 20s. And
I'm trying to slow down a little bit too, but I'm also trying to address whatever comments come my way. So to speak to what you were just saying, so this is Scott. This is early, and this is probably in chapter 2. I'm not sure. It's in my notes. Virtue involves what in this tradition, this intellectual tradition, is called a connaturality, a likeness or a sort of interior unity between the soul and the object at which any given virtue aims. So he says, through the presence in them of the virtue of art, they are in a way their work before they create it. To be able to form it, they have conformed to it. So that speaks to the kind of the intellectual virtue, and it's not even just like something you're sort of reasoning out in your mind. Actually, if you have the virtue of art, there is an intuitive aspect to it, even when you're not dealing with the fine arts, where your mind is contemplating the thing that it's going to create, and your mind is sort of shaped and conformed to that form. And then that enables you to make that form if the sort of physical obstacles to doing so are removed, which is how he kind of describes technique. Like it's just the removal of obstacles to the operation of the virtue of art.
I had to read a quote here because, like you said, he could be poetic, Thomas. Here on 11, he says, just kind of jump in the middle here, hence the despotic and all-absorbing power of art, and also its astonishing power for soothing. It frees from every human care. It establishes the artifacts, artist or artisan, in a world apart, cloistered, defined, and absolute, in which to devote all the strength and intelligence of his manhood to the service of the thing which he is making. This is true of every art. The ennui of living and willing ceases on the threshold of every studio or workshop.
Yeah, it's very moving, isn't it? Yeah, he and this is a guy, you could tell this is a guy who hung out with artists. He hung out with people who do this. And he's able to understand them from the inside to some extent. And he extends that to, like he says, the artifacts there.
Ennui, that's like a boredom from pointlessness, right? What does ennui mean, Karl?
Oh, heck.
Listlessness.
I don't know. But boredom caused maybe sloth. It's like the sadness at good things.
It's boredom because you're a degenerate.
The OED says the feeling of...
So French boredom.
Right. It says the feeling of mental weariness and dissatisfaction produced by want of occupation or by lack of interest in present surroundings or employments. I'll buy that.
Not to deduce on the French too much, because the French Thomists are pretty much the best Thomists of the 20th century. I mean, like, I'm just continually blown away. And like, what was in the water in like the first half of the 20th century with some of these...
Maybe it's what wasn't in the water.
Not fluoride. Yeah, it was sparkling. I'm sure it was sparkling water. Yeah, I mean, guys like him, Gilson, Sertalange, who I almost suggested we discuss here. Garrigou-Lagrange, who is one of Maritain's mentors, great theologian. Some people say the greatest theologian, Thomist theologian of the 20th century.
This book is practical. I'm pounding on it. He says the ennui of living willing ceases on the threshold of a workshop.
Makes a nice sound.
Most of the people in the Western world are experiencing devastating ennui right now. We've been locked up, not listened to, whatever. 2020 and 2021 have not been easy. They have not been years when people felt agency and life bubbling out of them. And he says right here, the ennui of living and willing ceases on the threshold of every studio or workshop. And I know that's true. I know that's true. Like, I get up, I've got a greenhouse to build, I go down there and do it, I'm effective, I can act, I know who I am, I know what the world is, I know how we fit together while I'm doing that. It's wonderful. So if you're having that thing, if you're experiencing that, do something. Do something. Build a ship in a bottle, for crying out loud.
Yeah. It's also, it's partially because it connects us with the world, but it's also partially because it's what we were made to be. I mean, we are made in the image of, the craftsman. And so there is a certain peace that you get in your soul when you're doing what you were made to do, even if it's just sort of broadly as a human being, as opposed to this is my specific vocation. You're fulfilling your nature in some way. And that's kind of what peace is, by definition.
How sad would spiders be if they couldn't make webs?
Oh my gosh. That is the most depressing thought ever.
Build
That's
something.
heavy, man. Maybe we should talk. Do you think should we move on to beauty now? Should we add beauty into the discussion since we've talked a lot about the craft?
I wanted to. Yeah, we got to do that. Whatever a habitus is.
Oh, right, yeah.
Which I wish I had.
Are you sure?
This is the thing that Miles Davis had, but I don't. Not very much.
You might have some that he didn't, though, Karl.
But, you can practice trumpet for years and years and years, and you can learn how to play jazz and technically be within the chord structures, and so you don't embarrass yourself at the jam session. But then, the real guys show up, and there's something sparkly about it. And I don't know how to get that.
The guy that shows up with the habitus, he doesn't just know how to play, he knows what to play.
Yeah.
I think. Habitus, it's tough. Chapter 4?
Yes. It's tough. I think that there's more what Karl is talking about here. I think there's more actually than just the virtue, because I think the virtue actually attains to things that transcend the virtue if you have the sort of artistic gift that you're talking about in a Miles Davis. So I think that, a virtue technically is accessible to anybody who works at it, right? But I think there are certain things, sort of what Maritain is going to describe as creative intuition that some people are especially gifted with. But yeah, there is a certainty. I mean, you Scott, you said they know what to play. Well, that kind of fits in with what Maritain says. A virtue is undeviating from its object. I love that he uses that word. It's something that's flexible and it's spontaneous. It's not a set of rules to be imposed by outside, from outside. Least of all in the fine arts is it a set of rules to be imposed from the outside. It is actually something that, by that connaturality, that likeness with the object at which the work aims, it's actually something that is generating itself. The rules of the work are generating themselves spontaneously according to the needs of the circumstances and according to the specific work to be made. And it does so in an undeviating way. So other things might get in the way. But Charlie Parker, he has the virtue of art, and the fact that he's a heroin addict and might not be able to move his fingers, because he's so messed up at a certain day, doesn't mean he doesn't have the virtue of art, because that intellectual virtue, that is undeviating from its object as far as his soul is concerned.
So the art then, this is might be inside baseball stuff, but then art cannot be a moral virtue.
Right. Yeah. And that's kind of where he starts, or kind of near the beginning of the book in the second chapter. Yeah. Art's not a moral virtue.
Everybody should be able to acquire the moral virtues, but not everybody can acquire the habitus of art.
I don't know if that follows. I think all virtues that are natural virtues are by definition obtainable if they're intellectual virtues. But that doesn't mean that you have the sort of the gift of the fine artist or whatever. But that's a separate, I see that as being a separate, a thing that the virtue works with, and the virtue is used is kind of used by inspiration or what have you. I think the virtue itself, I think from reading this book that at least Maritain thinks that anybody can develop the virtue, but he also says it's for the few because only a few actually do develop it. Because towards the end, he has a chapter on the rules of art, and he says anybody can apply a set of rules, but only a few. Anybody can have a method, but only a few have a virtue.
If I'm tone deaf and I go to the Thomas Mears School of Practical Piano and become an apprentice, how good can I get?
Yeah, I don't know. Can tone deaf people be taught to? I would say yeah.
All the notes on your piano sound the same to me.
I think that's true. Maritain definitely would see that as I think he would definitely see that as an external obstacle, like that's maybe a physical problem or something.
Mm-hmm.
But that might prevent you from actually developing the virtue. But I think that maybe sort of like abnormal defects aside, I think like it seems to me, and again, I'm not an expert in scholasticism, but it seems to me that according to this idea of virtue, it is accessible to anyone, even the non-moral virtues, if you practice, if you work at it.
It is accessible to man, the rational animal, though some, through accidents, have deficiencies that prevent them from developing certain virtues or habitus.
Oh, nice. Okay.
I think it's what Thomas would say. How about that?
Wait, I thought you were quoting someone.
No, I mean, that's the thing, right? You have...
See, the Oklahoma Thomists are the greatest Thomists of the 21st century.
No, well, man is the rational animal, right? And we pursue this beatific vision in all things we do, and he has certain characteristics, but not every man has all of those characteristics in their fullest extent. And he talks about, certain individuals may have deficiencies, but that doesn't make them less people. It just makes some of these things harder for them. And I still want to hammer on habitus. I think this is super important. It sounds like habit, listener, but it ain't habit, right? I'm going to read the first, chunk here of section 4. It's called Art and Intellectual Virtue. I read it several times, and I'm still not sure I know what habitus is. He says, to summarize now the teaching of the schools concerning art in general, considered in the artist or the artisan and as peculiar to him. Reads like a scholastic, doesn't it? 1, art is before all intellectual, and its activity consists in impressing an idea upon matter. Therefore, it resides in the mind of the artifex, or, as they say, it is subject in that mind. It is certain of that mind. 2, the ancients applied the term habitus to qualities of a distinct and separate kind, essentially permanent conditions perfecting in the line of its own nature the subject they inform. Health and beauty are habitus of the body, sanctifying a grace, supernatural, habitus of the soul. Other habitus have for subject the faculties or powers of the soul, and as these naturally tend to action, the habitus related to them perfect them in their very dynamism are operative habitus. Such are the intellectual and moral virtues. That's tough. A little bit more. We acquire the last mentioned kind of habitus by exercise and customary use, but we must not therefore confuse habitus in the present technical sense with the modern meaning of habit, namely mere mechanical bent and routine. The two are utterly different and opposed. Customary habit, which attests the solid weight of matter, resides in the nerve centers. It's muscle memory. Operative habitus, which attests the activity of the mind, resides chiefly in an immaterial faculty only, in the mind or the will. Yeah. Habitus are interior growths of spontaneous life, vital developments which make the soul better in a given sphere and fill it full of vigorous sap.
Yeah, I love that. I think that spontaneity is always very important with the Thomistic view of virtue, because a lot of people do think like morality is a set of rules to be applied externally, and there are unchanging moral truths, but the fact is the moral virtues actually apply themselves in a fresh way in every situation. That's not situation ethics. It's just the way that virtue works.
I'm just laughing at the Latin there. The Turgentia ubera animae. Ubera is Latin for teats.
Oh, dear.
Turgid.
Teats of the spirit.
Karl, what did I tell you? What did I tell you? Don't talk like that.
What does turgentia mean? Does it share a root with turgid?
I'm thinking it's like fulsome or something, but give me a moment and I'll look it up with the power of the internet.
The fulsome teats of the soul. Anime.
Swelling.
I knew we were going to get here eventually.
All right.
It's Metropolis all over again.
No. It's marvelous. Habitus, which is plural in Latin, are interior growths of spontaneous life. Vital developments make the soul better in a given sphere and fill it full of a vigorous sap. Fulsome teats of soul, as John of St. Thomas calls them. So you got to translate the Latin. So you get this image. Here we are back on the farm, Thomas. And you have the cow with its Turgentia ubera.
Yeah.
Okay? Which shows you that this is not merely like an intellectual exercise or a logic thing. It's spurting out of you, just like, when Miles Davis comes to play and picks up his horn, it's not, well, this is what I played in my Arbin book.
Yes.
This is what comes out.
We call the virtues a second nature, like literally. They're a second nature. They actually develop and alter you in your substance.
Yeah, and you're a better musician than I. You have the experience of the music has to come out. You have to play this. Mm-hmm. It's like I have to leave this social situation. I got to go play piano for a while. I don't know if you have that experience. And you don't know what you're going to play. And it comes out and it's good.
Yeah.
And you're like, where did that come from?
Especially because I'm an improviser. So my experience of that is especially not poignant. That's not the word I'm looking for, but I'm especially conscious of that aspect of it, that outflow aspect of it. Because I don't have the chance to sit and reason it out in a discursive way.
If you ever work with, sometimes you'll work with someone. I will work with someone doing whatever. We're going to put some fence in. We're going to build a greenhouse, whatever. And there are certain folks, and you say, okay, we're going to work on this Thursday. And they show up and they're like, they know what to do. And they're like, let's go. And they drive the whole thing. And it's not that they're a slave driver and they're cracking the whip. They know what's next every time, and they're right there with the thing in their hand, ready. It's an intuition that is born of, definitely of practice. He wants to make a distinction between the sort of habit that we talk about nowadays and a habitus, but you can't have the habitus without the practice. But they can comprehend the entirety of the job in their mind at one time, with holding all of the pieces of the thing in their mind at the same time. They know what the right thing to do at the right time is. They know what's next. And not only that, but they want to do it. And it's infectious. It's like, all right, then let's go. And the job goes better. Not only does it go better, but it is better because that person is there. And there have been times when I was that guy, and there have been times when somebody else was. And when you're that guy, you can feel it. And when somebody else is there, I can see it. And you can't melt that and pour that on somebody. I don't know what it's born of, but I think that's the habitus.
Yeah, he says it's a metaphysical title of virtue. Or, a metaphysical title of nobility.
Yeah. So I was fascinated by this concept and wanted to figure out how to get it. of interest, perhaps, is, so habitus is not the same thing as English habit. Where you will find it being the same sort of thing is, it is when the nuns and the brothers and the monks used to wear these things, they call them habits. So when the young lady, vows herself to the cloistered order and takes out the habit, which it refers to the clothing, but it means more than that. It means the habitus of being this particular vowed religious. So that gives you a different sense. Like, your life is supposed to change. It's supposed to have this coming forth of that kind of life. And so I wanted to know how you get it. And he gives some suggestions. He says it should be apprenticeship. And I know this is jumping, and if you want to come back, I'm jumping 30 pages, but we can go back. So on page 42...
He's criticizing the development of academic art quite a lot in this book. That's actually like a major theme in this book, insofar as his practical application is concerned.
Yeah, can you learn art from a book? No. I mean, precisely because, this is on page 42, precisely because art is a virtue of the practical intellect, the naturally appropriate method of teaching it is education by apprenticeship. A working novitiate, there's that word, novitiate, like that young lady who took the habit. She goes through a novitiate. Under a master and in face of reality, not lessons doled out by teachers, and in truth, the bare idea of an academy of fine arts, especially in the sense given to it by the modern state, is as stupid in conception as the idea of an advanced course of virtue. And I love that. I used to teach ethics courses, okay, because the university I was at required them. Nobody ever got more ethical from an ethics course.
The very word ethics is somehow wobbly. I don't know.
See our episode on After Virtue by Alistair McIntyre. Yeah, he says, a working novitiate under a master and in face of reality. That's the key, man.
So, I can imagine if I really wanted to be Miles Davis without the drug problems, I probably got to join a combo. I probably got to be a working musician. I have to have somebody in there who's better than me. It's always the best situation for me as a musician was being the worst guy in the group.
I think one of the things that's a little mysterious about what this habit is that, like, okay, so it's not my physical technique. It's not my embouchure. It's not, it might be something about knowing how to form an embouchure. I don't know. Mm-hmm. Is it my knowledge of theory? Is that part of the habitus? Is ear training physical, or is it that which the ear training achieves that's more than just being able to recognize a tone? It's a little elusive, isn't it?
Yeah, so we were using music as an example a lot.
Yeah, because we're all musicians, so
yeah. So what you do, dear listener, when you become a musician is you practice a lot, and you practice boring stuff. You do scales, although I didn't find them that boring. I found them meditative. But you do all these things for trumpet, to get your fingers to do the things, and to get your face to be strong enough to do the things. And I've got books of jazz licks that you practice in all 12 keys, just so you have... What you're trying to do, when Thomas mentioned connaturality, you're trying to make your nature mirror the nature of music itself, so that when you go and the big band stops and it's your turn to play the solo, you are connatural with the music. You're not thinking. Like Scott talked about, the guy who shows up on the job and says, "No, this is what we do next." He's probably not thinking discursively. He's seeing what needs to happen.
Charlie Parker said you have to learn the chord changes and then forget them. Charlie Parker, for those who don't know, great jazz sax player.
Yes.
I spent 3 days with a man of great habitus a couple weeks ago. I went to Greg Judy's grazing school in Rucker, Missouri. Greg Judy raises beef and sheep. I'm going to tear up. A lot of people would say, "Oh, I'm a rancher or I'm a farmer." He doesn't say that. He says, "I'm a grazier." And he is. The humidity, the sun, the hour of the day, he apprehends all of that in terms of what that is going to do for his animals. He can't help it. I followed him around and watched him deal with these animals and teach and talk about it. And his whole being is tuned to taking care of these creatures. It's astounding.
Yeah.
And, you know, and if he gets anything wrong, reality lets him know. and through doing that, I think he's 61. And through doing that until he's in his 7th decade, like he is a grazier. He doesn't act like one. He doesn't do it from 9 to 5. The guy is a grazier. And when he sees a problem, he knows what to do. And if he sees a problem that is new to him, he still knows what to do because he has an integrated view of how his action can affect animal husbandry. So when he says something new, he knows what to do. And even if that thing he does ends up not being right, it was still the best thing for him to do at that time. I have no doubt that if facing a drought, a blizzard, grizzly bear attacks in the flock, like whatever, that he is best suited for dealing with that.
Maritain talks about this infallibility, this infallible rectitude of art as far as like the formal aspect of it is concerned. It's you have a virtue, it's not going to go wrong.
Yeah.
You know, there may be external conditions that cause a failure of some sort. He talks about somebody who has the habitus of art and a trembling hand, and he might make an imperfect work, but he has a faultless virtue. It's the same with prudence. I don't claim to understand prudence too well, but you know, you can be very prudent and still make a mistake in the concrete circumstances. But that doesn't mean you don't have the virtue of prudence.
That guy's super special. And when he stands up in front of everybody and starts talking, even if you don't care about that stuff, I think it would be completely obvious to anyone that he was super special. It was pretty astounding.
It shows you, it's like a glimpse into the beauty of virtue. You know, it's not even a moral virtue, but it's still so beautiful. And it's like, you imagine, like, what if we had that what if we all had that with everything? And it's like, that's not possible in this life, but just imagine a human being who is such a master of himself and the world around him. This is like, you know, pre-fall or something, somebody who is so attuned to everything that's going on. That's the meaning of diversity right there, is so that we can actually get a picture with all the different virtues that none of us has time to acquire all of in our lifetime. We can see that guy and look and see that's what a perfect human, like with this and this and what all these different people have, put them together, and that's what a perfect human being would look like, or something. I don't know. Yeah.
Well, before we were rolling tape, we were talking about some television show and YouTube and all of that. One of the coolest things about YouTube is, I mean, there's so much, you know, there's a whole lot of bad stuff, but one of the cool things is watching people build stuff. Watching art, by Maritain's definition,
making.
It's all art. Yeah, and it could be fine artists. You know, there's a guy that he has a lathe and he just spins wood and carves it and completely useless things, and it's fascinating. So that would be more like a fine art. So he's just taking a U root and polishing it just to see what it looks like, and it's beautiful and pointless. Or you can watch these people building houses, you know, people building cabins. I watched one, I don't know where they were from, Thailand or something. This man and woman went out and built a 2-level house out of bamboo.
Yeah, I've seen
it. It was just fascinating to watch them know exactly what to do, and they don't even talk, you know? And it's inspirational. I really think this idea of the habitus of art is very productive and motivating. You know, it makes me want to get good at stuff or talk to people who are good at stuff. It's a revelation of being to get metaphysical, to hang out with people who know what they're doing.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I felt that when, you know, Scott was describing this guy. I was like very moved by that.